raise research profile of our universities, especially in, well, in my case, in communication. So, and I'm also aware that there are some PhD students also in this room, which is wonderful because you are the future faculty. I've already been introduced, so I wouldn't be saying anything very much about my work, except to say that this is a field, international communication media, that I have been researching and writing about for at least 25 years and continue to do that. And this is such an amazingly changing field that by the time you write a book, in 6 months, a lot of the data, a lot of ideas have moved on because this vastly changing area of research and scholarship. So in this introductory lecture, I'm going to be talking about some ideas about global itself, how the notion of global has changed within the context of media and communication. I'll start with some kind of overview of what globalization as a concept is in relation to communication. And then in the second part, I would look at how the notion of the global itself is changing because power equations are shifting in the world. And that shift is particularly visible within the digital space, and especially in Asia, where the scale and scope of change is so profound, it's actually forcing us to rethink what constitutes global. Okay, so let me just start with a standard definition of globalization. There are several. I chosen this because this relates to communication. The growth and acceleration of economic and cultural networks which operate on a worldwide scale and basis. This I've taken from a dictionary of communication studies. What is interesting about this definition is that two words essentially, growth and acceleration. So the assumption is those networks have always existed. If you look back in history, although we didn't call it globalization, but people have traveled, ideas have traveled, trade has been international for as long as we can remember, empires have existed, technologies have moved and transformed from one part of the world to another. What is new about this globalization phenomena is that the speed with which this is happening is unprecedented, and the scale of it, growth, is phenomenal. Globalization as a phrase itself has a relatively recent history. The word global, and here I am sticking only with the English language. The idea of global appears in literature related to geography way back in 1890s. Globalize and globalism become popular in 1940s, largely in literature about international relations, international trade, etc. The term globalization is used for the first time in 1961, not surprisingly, in the Dictionary of American English. And then there's this famous article which was published in the Harvard Business Review in 1983, which spoke about globalization of markets. However, globalization as we understand it today is really a post-1990s phenomenon. When it becomes a popular concept, if you were to do a Google search of terms with globalization in the title of academic books, academic journals, journalistic pieces, policy reports, you will find that most of it is post-1990s. And there are very clear reasons for that, namely the end of the Cold War, the shifting alliances in the world, the opening up of new markets, etc. So globalization becomes a buzzword, and it's essentially an idea which emerges in the United States and then is circulated around the world. Now, Just very briefly, I want to share with you some of its characteristics, of what we understand by globalization. And these are the dominant ones, right? Dominant characteristics. The idea that we are all connected, we are living in a global village, distances don't matter, the idea of death of distance, of time and space compression. Although the idea of global village goes back to 1960s to Marshall McLuhan, but it's been resurrected in the 1990s, and globalization represents that shift, that there is a time-space compression, distance do not matter. And of course, in the age of the internet, it's absolutely true. It doesn't matter where you live, you are connected all the time. The other characteristics of globalization in the dominant discourses is the idea of modernity. We're all modern now. We all live in modern societies, there are nation states, there is capitalism, some version of it, and global media and communication networks are available across the globe. Right? So we're all modern now. Of course, modernity itself is a complex idea. The Chinese were producing books 1,000 years before books were published in Europe. Is that modern? That's a discussion we can have later. But the idea of modernity as understood in contemporary world, which seems to have been emerged from European Enlightenment. Thank you. So globalization has meant that modernity has been extended to every part of the world. A third characteristic is that globalization, and particularly new technologies, particularly the internet, has created possibilities of a global civil society that we see in the context especially of environmental issues, for instance, the idea of global commons, global debates surrounding human rights, about gender inequality, about racial and ethnic disparities, etc. That again is a positive aspect of globalization. A third force, if you like, has emerged, which is not controlled by the states or by private capital, which is global civil society. And internet is central in creating those connectivities. And if you look around the literature on globalization, these three ideas sort of emerge as the dominant ideas. Distances don't matter, we are all modern, and we are all committed to civil society, and we think beyond our national borders. We have a global awareness and consciousness. There's also another side of the argument, which is the fear that globalization also means Americanization. Yeah? And cultures around the world are undermined by this domination of mainly US media, and with this availability of this content around the world, there is concern about identities, cultural distinctiveness, the idea of homogenization of cultures, McDonaldization of popular culture. And you could argue that across the world, when you see reactions to that, extreme cases could be 9/11, right? You could argue that. But there is some version of that across the globe. In fact, a very strong tradition of revivalism of traditional cultures, particularly in India. What globalization has also done, and I think that's very relevant for our course, is it has created a global market for media products. We have a dedicated lecture on that tomorrow, so I'll just go through some this basic level. What has helped create this global market is, I already mentioned, the end of the Cold War, change of political landscape around the world, but also, most importantly, technological revolution. First, cable and satellite revolution, and more recently, digitization. General trend towards liberalization, as we see in most sectors of the economy, including media and communication, has created space for a globalized market. And deregulation of media industries. I don't know how many of you remember it, but we used to have a highly regulated telecom sector in this country. Getting a telephone connection was a project in itself. When I was a student, it took a decade or more to get a basic telephone connection. Today, you have smartphones in rural India. Right? So, you could argue that deregulation of the industry has also helped create that global market. And at the heart of this is growing trend towards privatization, that again you see across sectors, including in media and communications. The other thing which has happened at the same time is the most big beneficiaries of this privatization, liberalization, deregulation are essentially big companies, the multinationals, the TNCs, transnational corporations. But even there is an interesting shift of where power resides. This is something which I saw in the Economist magazine, and it shows the difference between corporate power structures. So, if you look at this chart in 2006, the big money was with traditional industries. By 2016, Apple and Alphabet is Google, Microsoft, etc., etc. Amazon is there, Facebook is there. 10 years ago, these companies were not, some of them didn't exist. So, therefore, the digital space is increasingly contested because there is a lot of money to be made in this. It is still evolving, this space, and therefore there is an interesting contestation going on between the old money and the new money, if you like, old corporate structures and new corporate structures. And of course, technology is at the heart of this change. Now, technology has had a very important political economic dimension. I think it's fair to say that in the IIT, because we are known internationally as hub of IT industry, and IITs of India have done a tremendous work in creating that perception and that reality. So how does technology actually help big business? Here I'm using a quotation from one of my favorite authors, and this is a very American view of it, but actually quite an interesting one. The information flows transported over the network serve to command and rationalize economic activity and to extend the reach of corporate marketing to every corner of the earth. Right? You provide the infrastructure, then you supply the software. Yeah? So, pipes are yours, but also the content that's going through those pipes is also yours. Communication infrastructure provides the circuitry for the already immense and still increasing flow of the product of the mostly but not exclusively US cultural industries. If you think of global communication infrastructure, it is even now largely controlled by the United States. And if you look at the media content that people around the world consume, a large proportion of that comes from the United States. So, there is a direct connection between the infrastructure and the software. This is a quotation from Herbert Schiller, who wrote extensively in he's a professor in the United States, late Herb Schiller, I should say, and I had the privilege to work with him. A book that was mentioned in the introduction called Electronic Empires, was published in 1998. He wrote a fantastic chapter in it, and I was the editor of the book. That was one of the last things he wrote. This quotation is from a book which was published in 1992. If Schiller was writing today, he would probably replace, every corner of the earth to every individual on the planet. Because now we all have those accounts and we have access, and people know that we have access and they sell us stuff. Where does media fit into this then? People like you and me, we are a minority in the global scheme of things. We have experiences where we learn about other cultures, other communities, we consume, we have sources of information apart from the media. But for most people in the world, media are very important, both in terms of what we understand by globalization, because that's how it is mediated, and also how we understand other cultures. In intercultural communication, media are central. As source of information, basic information about what's happening in other parts of the world, as well as understanding other cultures. Because as I said, most of us do not have that direct one-to-one influence. I'm very fortunate, I live in London, which is a global city, so even if you don't read the newspaper, you meet a Nigerian, you meet a Turk, you meet an American, you work with these people, so you have a certain understanding of, but if you're living in majority of the world, you don't have that direct access. So you are finding about how an African behaves by what you've seen in a bad American film. So of course there are dominant media flows, and they are without doubt still English speaking, they're American, they're US based, they're Hollywood originated, but there are also other flows. They're not necessarily contra, we'll talk about that perhaps in a different lecture, but they do exist, whether it is in the field of entertainment or in news and current affairs, and particularly on the cyberspace, and I'll come to that in a minute. I've got some examples here from Al Jazeera to Bollywood to Mexican telenovelas, etc. A more recent phenomena where media has really become so much more integrated in our lives is digitization. That the format is all zeros and ones. It is standard format. So it travels very quickly around the world. You don't lose your formats, which is very important. I'm old enough to remember that if you had a VHS, and you wanted to go to America, I live in UK, so if I'm going to America and show a little clip, you had to convert that into the American system so that you could show it, and vice versa. Young generation wouldn't know what VHS is. So online delivery of extraordinary amount of data traveling in exceptional speed in one format. And indeed, with the mobile internet, 5G is coming next few years, we're living in a network society, and it is a global network society, and it's a global mobile network society. And this whole media edifice is essentially commercial, and that has implications. It is transnational, it is market driven, it is infotainment oriented. Okay, I'm doing a very crude summary, but I think gives you a broader picture of what's happening. It has also led to increasing amount of concentration of media power among fewer and fewer hugely influential and increasingly globalized conglomerates. Still largely Western, but others are also coming, and I'll come to that in a minute. And therefore, great degree of concentration of power. And that media power is also exercised in other domains, including in politics. This also meant that the public media, this is a trend across the world, is constantly undermined. And the space within which the public debate is constructed, the public sphere as Habermas calls it, that space has been privatized and colonized. So you can have a fake debate. We saw that in all its glory in 2016 US election, where a reality TV star who had no experience of any public office whatsoever is elected as the most powerful man on the planet. And I wouldn't be surprised if he repeats that feat in 2 years' time. So the public media around the world is undermined, especially the visual media. Here is some data to kind of contextualize this. This is slightly older data because I couldn't get it any up-to-date data, but it gives you, and fundamentally it hasn't changed. If you look at this map, look at North America. The blue one is the public television, right? So advertising revenue in North America constitutes about 40% of all revenue. Public funding is 1%. And that really, we're talking about Canada. Canada has a reasonably developed public service broadcasting. In the United States, it's all commercial. In Europe, in contrast to that, still a quarter of the funding is for public broadcasters. And therefore, BBC, even in 2018, provides content without advertising on its television, on its radio, on its website. Remarkable. So, and as you see, this is a trend you see everywhere apart from Europe and to some extent in East Asia, where both Japan and South Korea have a highly developed public service tradition. This has also led to claims that this is media imperialism, there's so much of power in the hands of private corporations whose agenda may be different from public agenda, or they might have the capacity to actually manipulate and manage public agenda. This is a quotation from Professor Boyd Barrett from an article that he wrote in 1977, which was actually, he's the guy who coined this phrase, media imperialism. And more recently, I think it was 2014, he actually wrote a full-length book simply called Media Imperialism, where he extends his argument to include the digital space, the so-called digital empires. And these empires are, of course, the United States remains a very important player, but it is not the only player. Something far more significant, in my view, is happening in Asia, and particularly in China. I have here two examples from telecom, from mobile, and from e-commerce from China, but also from social media. And this was a cover in Economist a couple of years ago, where Mr. Zuckerberg was presented as a Roman emperor. It is actually an imperial position. In fact, as many of you know, I'm sure, if Facebook was a country, it would be the largest country in the world. Right? Just imagine the power that person wields. We are very happy to. Anyway, that's a different, probably later discussion why we do that. Just take it close. So, globalization as we understood it until recently is a globalization which emerges in the United States, which extends all through the 1990s through processes I discussed: liberalization, privatization, digitization, and creates this extraordinary power structure where corporates have far more power than ever in recent history. We have to go back a little bit to the East India Company and that era. In modern world, the states were far more important. So states all around the world are undermined, power shifts to corporates, and corporates are not particularly accountable to public. They are accountable to their shareholders. Very basic corporate structure. And that system works well. It makes billionaires out of university students, especially if they're Harvard University students. But that era seems to be coming to quite not end, but it's sort of diminishing. To the extent that there is now a concerted debate about anti-globalization, particularly in the United States, particularly in Europe and in the UK. This is a long story that the Economist ran last year, year before, I think it was, against multilateral organization, WTO, which was created by the West, against free markets, created by the West, against liberalization. Right? So something quite fundamentally has changed. And it has also something to do with the changing geopolitics of the world. You see, I'm actually a communication professor, but I have a PhD in international relations. I did my PhD in this wonderful university called Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, which gets very bad press these days, but it is a pretty decent place, I tell you, fantastic place. So I'm looking at it from a sort of IR perspective rather than just media communication perspective. That could, in my view, limiting, because the issues are connected. You can't study media on its own, it doesn't make sense. Of course, you can do professional aspects of it, which is wonderful, but to really think about it in the context of how these dots are connected, you got to have some disciplinary background, whether it's history, politics, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, whatever. So in the geopolitical context, there has been, in my view, quite significant change. One is, of course, the change of the position in the United States, that they have really changed fundamentally about how international trade should be conducted. As you know, there's a war going on with China. The middle picture is the Chinese president speaking at the World Economic Forum last year. First time in the history of Davos, they had a communist leader and communist party chairman speak, keynote speaker. If you do get a chance to Google and read that speech, and it's in Chinese, but you can get the text. And he's talking about neoliberalism, frictionless capitalism, etc. The kind of language that we've heard from the Western professors and policy people and politicians, not from the Chinese. Quite interesting shift. And also the way these things are communicated. The whole Twitter space, which has now become a political arena. So when Mr. Modi was visiting Washington a couple of years ago, a very good friend of mine told me, why should you wait for the New York Times editorial, what they're saying about it? Just look at the president's tweet, what he has to say in wrong English, right? Or grammatically incorrect English. So this has really changed political communication in the United States, and by extension globally. The whole diplomatic debate is now, what is the tweet saying? And that's happening in other parts of the world as well. But I think the most significant change, which these are manifestations of. And that change is, there is power shift taking place. Economic power is shifting. And economic power also reflects other types of power, cultural power, media power, etc. And the traditional domination of these sectors by the West and within that, the United States, is being challenged gradually, slowly, but it's happening. And like any person or institution which is in the position of privilege, nobody wants to lose that privilege. So there's an interesting contestation going on. And I think the debates about globalization are intimately connected with that. Now, what is this shift? I did some data crunching to actually see where the big money is. So this is Fortune 500. Fortune magazine, as you all know, is a very well-known American business magazine, which every year produces list of top 500 multinational companies in the world. And it's quite detailed, you know, their investment, their staff, their profits, etc., etc. And as you can see in this chart, there is an interesting change taking place within the top 500. In 2000, there were only 10 Chinese companies in the top 500. By 2016, that figure had climbed to 109 companies. So every 5 years, the number of Chinese companies in the top 500 has doubled. And there is a corresponding decline in the American numbers. Now, this is publicly available data. This is not the data that the Chinese government has massaged and manipulated. This is an American magazine. And corporate structures are complex. Right? Money could be coming from different sources. It could be some Saudi money, some Russian oligarchs' money, some of our Nirav Modi type of people, their money. I don't know. But the trend is clear that the power is actually moving away from what used to be exclusively Western domain. There were a few Japanese, few Korean, few Brazilian, 1 or 2 Indian companies in that list. It was essentially US, Europe, and Japan. And now the second largest is China. And if you look at the latest, in the top 10, 4 are Chinese. And they are in strategic areas: telecommunication, banking, energy. So, interesting shift in power. The gap between the United States and China is declining in terms of multinational corporations. Is now 132 to 109. Even more interesting, the geopolitics of trade, global trade. This is from a book called Connectography, which is published by Parag Khanna, who used to be at Harvard. He is an economist. And it shows that the countries with which China is doing largest trade, the numbers are 124. In case of the United States, that's 56. If you're the biggest trading partner of a country, you have a certain influence in the policy of that country and the region, as we know from South Asia. Again, this is publicly available data. Yeah? If we don't engage with it, that's our choice, but it's happening and documented. In fact, this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit, very recent data. The GDP within the United States and China is, again, the graph is coming very close. Suggestions are that by before 2028, 27, it will surpass the United States. It's already the largest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. That happened in 2014. The American think tanks were saying it will be in 2025 that the United States will be second in terms of purchasing power parity. The Chinese did it 10 years earlier. So there's an economic shift, a substantial shift, a documented shift. But power is not just economic. Militarily, US is ahead of everybody else on this planet by some distance. This is latest from SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute, which monitors these things. So US military budget is $610 billion, was in 2070, which is likely to be raised. Mr. Trump is very keen on that. China is the second. United States has 600 plus declared bases military bases. China has one. Another one is under construction. Third one is two, but that's not declared. There is one in Djibouti. So in terms of military power, there's no comparison. Right? But economically, it's getting closer. The most significant change, I think, in this is not really something which we should be too worried about. It's not our field. I just wanted to put that there just in terms of contextualizing it. The most exciting change is in what's happening within the cyberspace. As you all know, internet was devised and developed in the United States. United States still controls its governance, its infrastructure, etc. Its commerce too. But if you look at this chart, in 1995, when internet was just beginning to be privatized, as many as 61% of the population which was using the internet were Americans. By 2014, that figure had shrunk to 10%. Today, it is even less. Which means that majority of people who are using the internet are not Americans. In fact, the largest number is in China, 772 million end of last year. Of course, it's Mandarin internet, it's not English internet. As you have the Hindi and the Tamil and the Bangla and the Telugu internet. I called it world's biggest open because the Chinese one is not open. Estimates say that by 2020 we'll have 600 million internet users in this country. I think that will happen sooner, maybe by end of 2019. Because there is an interesting convergence between national capital, Reliance, good case in point, a pro-business government, a prime minister's almost total commitment to the idea of digital India, and transnational capital, which sees India as the most incredible market and hugely under-exploited market. Right? And unlike China, where they can't operate in the way they do here, India is the place to go. It may just be a coincidence that the guy who had Google and the guy who had Microsoft had their first degrees in India. One of them at IIT actually here. So what's happening in the internet space is to us the most important aspect, because digital media operates in that structure. And that structure is under construction. There's a lot of contestation going on about who controls it, who has the control infrastructure, what are the governance structures, standards about portals, etc., etc. And that debate is continuing, and I would think at the beginning it's going to get much more complex and messier. More on that later. We have a lecture on internationalizing the internet later in the week. But I want to just take a step back and contextualize this shift in power in a historical sense. Because especially in our field, in media and communication, we have a very deep problem with history. We don't do history, right? So communication is, there's been communication going back for 5,000 years, but we think of it as television, radio, or etc. So if you go back a bit, and I'm not going that far back. Again, I'm using my Indian friends. So this is Arvind Subramanian's book, who just recently retired as Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He's written a fantastic book about China and India, and this is from that book. Top 3 countries by economic dominance, described as percentage share of global economic power, described as weighted by share of world GDP, trade and net capital exports. UK, the top in 1870, followed by Germany, then France, 1973, US, Japan, Germany. So UK is out in 1970. Somebody should tell that to Mrs. May. She doesn't understand. The world has changed. 2010, United States, China, Japan. And the forecast is 2030, it will be China, US and India. Some of you may know this, but in the 18th century, the largest GDP of the world came from Asia, most of it is from China, followed by India. There's a whole debate in certain parts of for Asia, especially articulated by Kishore Mahbubani of Singapore, who argues about not rise of Asia, but return of Asia. It's a different way of thinking about it. Right? Again, history is important. So I'll just end with a few points about are we entering a new phase of globalization in view of what I have said in this lecture, and what kind of globalization that might be. It really is speculative, but worth thinking about. You need to have some imagination to think of the future. The 2008 economic crisis, which is now 10 years old, I have argued elsewhere, was actually a very important point to say, well, this is the end of certain version of globalization. The neoliberal Anglo Globalization. And we were lucky in India that despite what we say about our elite, they were actually very careful the way they dealt with globalization. The phrase used was calibrated globalization. We'll open up, but we'll open up slowly and steadily, so we don't lose total control. So when 2008 happened, India suffered, but not as much as many other developing countries did. Same with China. Although their economy is far more integrated in the world than ours, but they were very careful how they protected their interests. So a certain version of globalization, some people call it Anglo Globalization, is coming to an end. It won't happen tomorrow, in 10 years, 20 years, but the trend is there. And this also means then the media and communication world will reflect those changes. Increasingly, you will see content in the media which is localized, this whole idea of globalization. An increasing amount of hybridization. cultural mixing. Of course, the dominant culture will still be the dominant culture. That's not going to change anytime soon. But just that dominant culture wouldn't work. It needs to bring in the local element into it. For very basic market reasons. Not that they are very respectful to other cultures. They're doing it because it makes marketing sense. The flows, especially in the digital space, are expanding tremendously because now the technology is there, the connectivity is there. And that would also mean a lot of reverse flow will take place, is already taking place. Some estimates say there is more stuff on YouTube which is Bollywood oriented than Hollywood oriented. Precisely because there's so many Indians, 1.2 billion in this country and then 25 million outside, they are in some shape or form connected. And cinema is an obsession in this country and in diaspora. So that's just one example. But the flow is multicultural, multilingual, multidirectional. That's not to say the dominant flow is going to disappear. It's going to be there, and they're devising new ways to get into the new markets. But this is going to become an interesting, and already is an interesting space to observe as researchers, as scholars. Also, new formulations, new groupings. BRICS is one. I mentioned that because I've done some work on it. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Already they constitute some important countries, both economically, I already mentioned, but also militarily. Let's not forget Russia is sitting with the largest number of nuclear weapons on this planet, and it's an energy empire. So these are serious countries. And if they start getting together and say, okay, we got to have, and it's interesting, the whole idea of BRICS started to take shape after the 2008 economic crisis. And they said we had to have an alternative system to deal with this excesses of neoliberalism, if you like. And BRICS itself is a very different, it comprises very different countries. So Brazil is very different from China. China is very different from Russia, right? But within these two, I think, in my own humble view, the equation between the two major countries in BRICS, China and India, is going to define what happens to globalization. How do we define global? Just because the scale and scope is so huge. And remember, these are not just nation states. As nation states, they're relatively new. India became a nation state in 1947. Chinese Revolution took place in 1949. But as civilizations, continuously surviving civilizations, they have a very, very long and complex and distinguished history. And they're all both growing very rapidly economically also. Of course, this growth is distorted, there are a lot of problems, inequalities, environmental costs, etc., etc. But it is also the case that these two big nation states, civilizational states, are also the two largest economies, fastest growing economies, and India is already, as we know, the sixth largest. It overtook France last week, and in purchasing power parity, it is third largest. So what happens in these two, that dynamic, in my view, is the most significant in terms of what we understand by the global, a global which is beyond the Western version of that globalization. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you for your attention. Okay?
We have tea outside, then we reassemble at 11:30 for the next section.
Same place?
Right here.
No, but lecture is here.
The lecture.
Okay, good. I'm happy to take questions or comments over the tea, but also we'll have a break after the second lecture.
After the second lecture.
But also in the tea, we have. How long do we have for tea? Half an hour, fine. So I'm happy to take questions. हो गया सर? ठीक है. Can I put the other one? It's okay, it's not a problem. Thank you. And this was working, that's good. I can see this one. There's no gap. ठीक है? It's okay? Last 2 years ago. 2 years ago. Yeah, there was something else. It was some kind of alumni or something. It was some other scheme. Yeah, no, I've been here. My colleagues are here. No, I was here. 2 years ago. 2 years ago. August by. ओके टेस्ट कर लिया ठीक है हाँ
ठीक है सर.
ओके थैंक यू सो लेट मी नो व्हेन टू स्टार्ट है मुझे बता देना जब शुरू करना है ओके Okay, welcome back. We're going to have our second lecture. In the first one, I tried to give you a kind of macro picture of what's happening in the world of both politics, economics, technology, and also what it means to media and communication, all in one lecture. In this one, I'm going to be looking at how do we make sense of these changes in relation to media and communication theory, because as you would appreciate, study of media and communication has largely been devised and developed in the United States and in Europe. So the theories that we use in our research, in our scholarship, is often borrowed or adapted from work done elsewhere. There is a fundamental mismatch and problems thereof. As I mentioned in my previous lecture also, there is a significant power shift taking place, and I mentioned one particular grouping in my lecture, if you remember, BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and they're getting together and becoming more assertive in the global space is also affecting the way people think about theorizing issues in various fields, including in communication media. So just to give a overview of what the BRICS in terms of their power structure, this is the data about BRICS GDP. And as you can see, the biggest player in this is China, followed by India and others. I have been studying the media in BRICS countries as part of a major project that was actually a project based in Finland, funded by the Finnish Academy, and a colleague who was actually in charge of this. His name is Professor Karle Nordenström. We did, it's a four-year project looking at different aspects of media in BRICS countries. It was the first study of this topic. But BRICS has also meant that it has created, if you like, or not just, but are in the process of creating new institutional infrastructure. Here are two examples. The BRICS Bank, National Development Bank as it is called, based in Shanghai and headed by an Indian person, as you probably know. And more recently, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, I call it the new Bretton Woods. Some of you would remember Bretton Woods is a small city outside Washington. This is where in 1944 the Allied powers got together and decided to create the infrastructure for global trade and finance, and the World Bank and the IMF were established. And since then, both IMF and World Bank have played a very significant role in managing global economy and also promoting free trade and markets. Now something similar is being done, but this time with Chinese expertise and money. And BRICS is one of the forum within which this is happening, BRICS Bank being one case in point. And in fact, the politics of it is very interesting because, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, BRICS emerges as an important voice after 2008, after the economic crisis in the West. And it is a Russian idea originally, and then the Chinese appropriate it to tell the world, look, we are not the only rising power, there are others too, Russia, India, Brazil, etc. So don't feel threatened, we are part of this rise of the rest, as sometimes described. As I mentioned before, I've been involved in looking at the media aspect of it with the colleagues in all the 5 countries. We've already published 2 books. The first one was where I was directly involved in, and I edited it with the colleague who actually was the head of this program at in Finland. And we published last year a book on journalism, specifically on BRICS journalism. And the third one I'm working on now, which is looking at media systems in BRICS countries, and a more theoretical intervention in terms of, is it providing a kind of alternative to the dominant US, UK based theorizing of media systems. So that's an interesting challenge. Hopefully it'll be out by end of next year. Now, this is not a lecture about BRICS, and that's not the most important part of this program. But within BRICS, 2 countries, to my mind, are very important, China and India, for reasons I already mentioned in the previous lecture in terms of their scale and scope. And what is happening to media in these 2 countries, how that affects the way we think about theorizing media is something I want to address. And how we might do that. Also, we can have that discussion afterwards, because this is very early stages of this thinking through the different theories. Just to kind of put it in the context, economically, both China and India are doing very well, as you see in this chart. They have steadily growing economies, expanding economies. But you will also notice that the Chinese economy is 5 times bigger than India's. China is much more integrated in the global economy than India is. China really is at a different stage of development. And I'll come to that, why that is significant for us in India. But that is also not to forget that the status quo in terms of where the power is hasn't changed that much. The big guys are still the big guys. For instance, if you look at the, this is the top companies, multinational companies, got to Fortune 500. If you see this is from 2016, 3 are from China, but US, Germany, Japan, UK, they are still there, right? But the Chinese are in the top 10. Chinese expansion in economic terms is not just confined to corporations. There's also an extraordinary project in infrastructure, which I'm sure some of you have come across. It's called the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. It used to be called One Belt, One Road. It is the world's largest infrastructure project. In fact, 90 projects, $1 trillion. And as you see on this map, it has both a maritime part as well as a land-based part. And some of the projects are already operational. For example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, $60 billion. Already is, the work is underway. It involves a whole range of infrastructure projects and has an important communication dimension to it. The talk is of digital Silk routes. If you go to the region, go to Bangladesh, go to Pakistan, go to Nepal, the digital infrastructure is very much influenced by the Chinese companies. Okay. Some of you may remember the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was put in place after the Second World War by the Americans to rebuild Europe, war-torn Europe. Yeah? And they are still there. Yeah? Europe doesn't have a foreign policy in 2018. Washington says something and next day Brussels follows that, repeats it. A very more moderate tone, but essentially the line is not very different. So just imagine BRI is global. It's not just one part of the world. And a lot of it is in developing parts. So just think ahead 20 years, 30 years down the line. That's for you to speculate. It is not just confined to the road and the sea lanes. This is also now reaching the pole. So one belt, one road, one pole. As you see on this map, China doesn't really have territorial claims on the North Pole. The Russians have, the Americans have, the Danes have, etc. China is far away from it. Because North Pole is very, very resource rich. Yeah. So this is how the thinking ahead, 30 years ahead. And we are talking about Mayavati versus X and X versus Y. Our choice, we are a great democracy. But this is happening, this is real. Now, how does this affect media and communication, if at all? Now, for this audience, I don't need to emphasize the point that the global media scene is dominated by the Americans. Yeah? For reasons well documented. I don't need to labor that point. In 1977, a well-known British media sociologist wrote a book. It was called "The Media Are American." And it did a historical study of why US media dominates the media globe and documented it very well. 30 years later, Professor Tunstall wrote another book. This time he called it "The Media Were American." And his main argument was that in large population countries like China, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, etc., actually a vast majority of people are not watching American media. They're watching domestic media. Domestic media is highly developed, very diverse, and available. And people relate to it in a manner that they don't with the Western media, apart from a tiny elite. This came for criticism also, because the argument was that actually, you could have Discovery in Hindi or Tamil. It's actually an American program which is dubbed in Tamil or Telugu or whatever language. So it's not really domestic, it's international product aimed for a domestic market or a regional market. One of the main reasons why people started talking about media were American was precisely because big countries like China and India have grown, the media space has grown so much in the last 20 years. China especially, outside China, people don't realize how big the Chinese media scene is. I was very fortunate to work on a book which has been published earlier this year. It's called China's Media Go Global. It's the first book on this topic in English that I edited with a colleague in China and a colleague in my own university. We have a China Media Center, which is the oldest in Europe, and I'm a research advisor to that center. In that capacity, I've had the experience to work with a lot of Chinese scholars, visiting scholars, students, and we go regularly there and they come to us. So there is a certain insight into what's happening in what is the largest market in the world. So doing this book sort of made me think how the Chinese media is now increasingly visible outside its territorial space, and how it is actually upsetting the traditional domination of American media. So for instance, what they call central media, and now they've made it into one kind of converged media: Xinhua News Agency, China Global Television Network, China Radio International, People's Daily, and China Daily. These are the key components of the strategy of going out, going global. These figures are difficult to ascertain because Chinese system is not very open. But estimates say there's something in the range of $4 to $5 billion annually are spent on external communication by Chinese government. If you contrast that with what the Indian government spends on Doordarshan, you don't even have to laugh, you have to cry. In fact, the budget is bigger than BBC and Al Jazeera and Voice of America combined. This is whole external communication. Broadcasting media are part of that. So CGTN global, this China Global Television Network, as you see on this map, has regional programming in different languages, including French, Spanish, Russian, and Arabic, and specific channels for both America and for Africa. In Africa particularly, they're spending a lot of effort and energy to get into that market. In fact, two of my PhD students did work on it, and some of it's already published, which looked at how the Africans deal with Chinese content, and how it is. The other one was how the BBC is dealing with this new player on the patch, their patch. So this is new. I don't know how many of you have occasion to watch it. It's the state propaganda channel. It gives the viewpoint of the Chinese Communist Party, but not just that. You see, one of the great things about being a scholar is that you need to be open to different ideas. If you're only watching what's happening in China by watching the BBC or CNN, you have a very limited view of what's happening in China. I can tell you from personal experience. If I was only watching the BBC about India, which is an open country, people speak English, and I would have a very distorted picture of this country. Okay? Unlike India, China is a closed society. So just for basic information, actually it's more than basic, they do pretty decent work now. It's providing a different perspective. Now, is it being noticed by media theorists? I doubt it. We'll come to that in a minute. Beijing Radio. China Radio International has the largest number of language services of any international broadcaster. There's a chapter in the book which is written by somebody who is a professor there and writes. She studied this in some length. But there are also client radio stations, private radio stations, which are doing the job for the Chinese government. And as you see in this map, they're mostly in strategic places in Europe and in the United States. Now, this is something that the Americans have done for 70 years. and the Europeans have done for it. It's nothing new. Yeah, you have a client radio station, claims to be independent. The whole NGO world is full of those anomalies, non-governmental, but actually funded by a government. So it's nothing new. But the Chinese are getting into that space. And doing very localized programs, like in the United States, very local city-based programs in American English. And then Xinhua, the news agency, now has almost as many correspondents as the big three, which is Reuters, AFP, and AP. And unlike AFP, AP, and Reuters, Xinhua also is pretty big in infrastructure. So if you're a poor country, you don't have broadband, the Chinese will say, we'll give you broadband, but then we'll give you Xinhua. Okay. I used to work at PTI in Delhi. Yesterday, no, it's like the day before, I was at press club in Delhi, and a colleague, old friend, told me that they haven't paid salaries to journalists for some months. National News Agency. So we are famously absent in the international news space. It's a tragedy. We have the advantage of English language. We have advantage of professional journalism. We are a democracy. We have discussion, arguments, disagreement. We are a multilingual country. We are a multi-religious country. We have all that, which the Chinese don't. But you don't have a correspondent of Doordarshan or All India Radio in London, Paris, Moscow, Beijing, New York. I could go on. And Indian journalists, I have some really decent journalist friends who are in London. They don't go beyond the diasporic ghetto. That's their area. Bollywood star has come, they'll have a story. Some restaurant has opened, nothing else. Does India have a view on Syria? If it is, the world doesn't know. Does India have a view on internet governance? This is at a time when there are 400 plus news channels in this country. Dozen plus channels in English language. They do, as you all know, shouting matches every night. But we are good at something else. We are good at exporting entertainment. And we've done that for a long time. As this slide shows you, from Russia to Egypt to more recently China. If you think of the popular cinema in the world, apart from the big guys, that's Hollywood, we are the only major country which exports cinema to 70 plus nations. We are also the only country in the world where more than 85% of domestic box office is for Indian cinema. It might be Tamil, Telugu, but it's Indian cinema. This again raises some interesting question. How do you theorize about globalization and culture, etc.? We are also present in other regions of the world. Here are two examples from the Arab world, where you have channels which are in Arabic, so they are not for the expat community, they are not for the South Asians who live there. These are for the Arabs because they are dubbed into Arabic. Two channels Azi runs in, and Azi has several others in different parts of the world, from Indonesia to Africa to even Hong Kong and East Asia. The most interesting change, I think, in terms of exports of entertainment and how that raises some interesting questions about how we see global media and how we theorize it, is what's happening between China and India. Bollywood in China as you see here, there's a steady growth of people watching Indian films. As you would appreciate, in China there is a quota system. Only 34 films are allowed to be released, foreign films are allowed to be released every year. 1 or 2 Indian films get released. And if you look at the films that is actually done well, the latest one which is done very well is Toilet Ek Prem Katha. Before that it was Hindi medium. Before that it was Secret Superstar. And then of course Dangal has been phenomenally successful. Now these are not your typical Bollywood films. They're films with highly sophisticated story. Very Indian story, set in rural India, small town India, but good stories. And very different from Hollywood films or our standard Bollywood blockbuster. I don't know how much you guys know about China, but China used to have a problem with sanitation as we have in this country. Especially women, like women in India have problem with sanitation. So if you're a Chinese woman, you see that, you see Toilet Ek Prem Katha, there's a resonance. Your mother had that problem, your aunt had that problem, when you were a child you had a problem, you go and see it and you tell your friends, go and see that film. And it has made the Chinese think about Bollywood in a different way. Because I don't know whether you remember this, you younger crowd than I am, but during the Cold War, they used to watch Indian films because they couldn't get Hollywood films, they were banned. So they needed some kind of escapism and Indian films provided those. It was only later that they stopped getting Indian films. And now, as you see, from 3 Idiots onwards, there has been a steady increase of films. And remember, it's 1 or 2 films a year. So I'm saying to my friends, you guys are obsessed with the West. Just go to East. There is a huge market. And there is actually a cultural connect which you don't have with the Americans or Europeans. But in terms of how you theorize, film studies scholars, anybody in this room, they would probably vouch me for this. But there is a problem. There is not enough theory how to make sense of this. Similarly, the other advantage we have, and it's an incredible advantage, is the diaspora. We have the second largest diaspora in the world. In fact, the largest English-speaking diaspora in the world. As you see in this from a book I did a few years ago, so data is slightly old. They're all over the world. In fact, remittances from diasporic Indians is the largest in the world, 70 billion plus annually that comes to India. And they are also ambassadors for Indian culture, Indian language, Indian history, philosophy, media. If you look at the courses in especially American universities on Bollywood, dozens of courses. 20 years ago, it didn't exist. People used to be ashamed to talk about this weird cinema. Now people see meanings in it. So again, in terms of theorizing, the jury is out. In social media too, we have I mentioned in the previous lecture too, huge advantage. To look at Facebook, for instance, the largest user in the world is India today. While still more than 60% of Indians are not online. So just imagine what will happen when they're all online. And imagine a day when we'll have our own Facebook. So you have, just for a moment sticking with these 2 countries because the scale is so huge. You have the Chinese presence in the world of news and current affairs, quite significant presence. Although how effective it is, who is watching it, etc., that the jury is out on that. But it is still early days and they are not operating in it as a commercial proposition. They are not bothered what advertising revenue they are getting for it. It's funded by the state, right? It's something else. It's part of foreign policy project. It's part of soft power project, if you like. And India has, again, for a very long time, exporting this entertainment, largely to the diaspora, but also beyond that. As I mentioned in case of China, to totally new constituency, and potentially a massively important constituency. Now, I could just go on. There are so many other examples I could give you beyond from India and China. But just to stick with these two. Have these been taken on board by media theorists? In fact, anything happening outside the Western world, has they been taken on board as theory, not as example? Yeah. So, again, this is a ongoing debate, has been going on for many decades. But in more recent times, I'll just go through some of the important work that has come out, just trying to think through theory of how we make sense of these changes. So first is about changes in media in Europe after the Cold War. Because you will appreciate during the Cold War, it was a very crude division of the world, communist versus capitalist, right? So of course we didn't fit into that. We were neither communist nor really capitalist. Yeah, we were just third world. So everything else was third world. Very different. I mean, Singapore is a city-state, very prosperous country. We are a continent. We were very poor, still are very poor. We were both third world. That was the level of crudity of scholarship, of kind of theorizing. So, when the Cold War ended, scholars started to look at the changes in media in Eastern Europe. So this is work done by an old colleague, John Downing. And this is what he had to say in a book published in 1996. Study of post-Cold War media was his focus in Eastern Europe particularly. And he says, to extrapolate theoretically from such relatively unrepresentative nations as Britain and the United States is both conceptually impoverishing and a peculiarly restricted version of even Eurocentrism. So you can't even explain what is happening in Europe, because you are using the framework of two major democracies, United States and UK, where there is a very different system, and you are trying to impose that on countries which have just transited from communism to market capitalism. There is a lot of confusion going on there. So he wrote this book, which was, to my mind, first kind of serious intervention about how we can think beyond the standard kind of Anglo-American theorizing. And then debates about de-Westernization became popular. This famous book which came out in the year 2000, De-Westernizing Media Studies, by James Curran and Professor Park, who is from South Korea. James Curran is British. This is what they had to say. They saw de-Westernizing as part of a growing reaction against the self-absorption and parochialism of much Western media theory. Remember, 1990s, late 90s, everybody's talking about globalization. But then Curran and Park argue that it's still a very Western view of what globalization is. And the theory is very parochial because it's only looking at the West and then expanding that, or extraposing that in other contexts, and it doesn't work. My own humble contribution to this debate was a conference I'd organized on on the theme of internationalizing media studies at my university in Westminster in London. It's a very big conference, 250 people came, some top scholars were there. And we produced a book with that title called Internationalizing Media Studies, where the essential argument was that de-Westernization has a certain negative connotation to it. In the West, especially in the United States, but also in parts of Europe, there has been some fantastic work done in media studies. Whether it's journalism, whether it's cultural studies, film studies, etc., and you can't just dismiss that. Yeah. As researchers, we have to see, how they conduct research, what are the methodologies, what works, what doesn't work. So we can't just say we need to de-Westernize. So I use the word internationalize, and my focus really was on imperatives for internationalizing media studies by broadening its remit, warranted by unprecedented growth of media in non-Western world. And by that I essentially meant China and India. Because as I said before, in both these countries, the media had grown so rapidly in the last 20 years. And using old theories which have come from US or UK or more broadly from Europe do not explain this phenomenon. I mean, you could explain it in terms of marketization, etc., there's something, but that doesn't explain everything. You can't explain Zee TV phenomena by just looking at markets. It's no coincidence the most popular program they had was Saregama, Antakshari, as Indian as you can get, right? And there are similar examples from different parts of the world. So, so the debate has been taking shape in various shapes and forms and in different disciplines. A certain amount of dissatisfaction with the existing theory and a need to broaden, as I say, broaden the remit of discourse. A colleague in China, she was in Hong Kong, then now she's retired, did another book around the same time, in fact a year later I think, De-Westernizing Communication Research. Georgette Wang, her name is. And her, again, it's a collected, collection of essays. She argued that we should go beyond this binary between Western and non-Western world. That too is very crude. Because, Bulgaria is in the West, but Bulgaria is not what we think when we think of the West. Yeah, nobody knows what is on TV in Bulgaria, or Greece for that matter. So West itself is a complicated term. Similarly, non-West or East, the Chinese use a lot of that East. What East? East of where? What? Yeah? So it has to be nuanced. It has to be something, in a country of this size, India, there is a Tamil media which is very different from media in Himachal Pradesh, right? The news culture is different in Tamil Nadu than in New Delhi. Same country. So, the suggestion that one has to go beyond these binaries, East-West, Western, non-Western. And even I've been saying this, like national boundaries, national discourses. I do believe that does matter because policy is still decided by nation states. Nation states do matter despite the debate within globalization that they will wither away. They are actually becoming more assertive. There's also, I want to mention another book which is relevant for this discussion. This is a book about media systems by Daniel Hallin, who is a professor in US, and Paolo Mancini, who is an Italian professor, retired now. they did a book about media systems, comparing media systems, which was published in 2004. And it's a very widely cited book, a very good book, I must add. But it was really looking at media systems in the United States and some parts of Europe. And it came in for a lot of criticism, even they didn't get the Europe right. So then they decided we need to expand it, and they came up with this book called Comparing Media Systems Beyond the Western World. This came out in 2012, and it had essays from different parts of the world to see how their media systems are and how are they comparable or not comparable or whatever. As an Indian academic, I was surprised to find that there was nothing on India in it. So as it happens, I know both these professors well. I meet them regularly at conferences, and I spoke to them both singly and together, asking them very politely, why is there nothing on India? Because I grew up and I study the global media scene. I always thought India was a non-Western country, whatever its many problems, but it is not a Western country. It's a elite, parts of elite might be westernized and corrupted by that. I don't want to go in there, but it is not a Western country. So you know what they said? They said, well, we couldn't find anybody to write a chapter. I said, one email, you got my email, just one email. I know at least half a dozen people who will write a decent chapter. In fact, one of my students is writing a book on Indian media system, and ex-student I should say. It's coming out hopefully by early next year. Because India is too complicated. It doesn't fit in the categories they want to fit it in. It doesn't fit in. It never did. In the Cold War, we were all, kya desh hai yaar, ye na is camp mein, na is camp mein. Well, look at our nuclear reactors. One with German help, one with French, one with British, one with Russian, one with Americans. उससे ज़्यादा non-aligned क्या चाहिए आपको? So you have to hats off to our people who ran this country. They were clever. So India doesn't fit in any of these categories. I remember when I went to the UK for the first time in 1988, still Cold War was on. I was in a youth hostel, I had no money. A Dutch guy, I was chatting to him and he said, you speak Russian? I said, no, I don't. What made you think that I should speak Russian? I'm speaking reasonably good English with you. And he said, no, because you are very close to the Soviet Union. That was the level of ignorance. That was the level of ignorance. So it didn't fit in. And therefore, it doesn't fit in today, because if you look at India, it's a very complex scene, including media scene. So I say this because as scholars, as teachers, you need to think, okay, what is distinctive about our system? What is it that is unique? And there are so many issues which are unique. Yeah. So that, because theory is not built in one day, one book, one conference. It takes time. It takes a long time, a lot of thinking by a lot of people. Yeah. So as we speak, the jury is still out on this. We don't know. And I've highlighted the problems, but there are certain prospects that I want to also sort of briefly mention before I stop. Sorry, just to kind of complete this. Anyway, I don't read it, you got it here. By the way, I'll also have all the slides sent to you, so you don't have to worry about it. You'll have all the material with you. Theorizing media and communication in a global context has become a major issue today. Precisely because what I said at the beginning and also in my previous lecture. because of the power equations that are changing. Some people are even arguing that a new kind of globalization is beginning to take shape. I mentioned the Chinese president being the keynote speaker last year at the Davos. This year it was Mr. Modi. Again, after many years, the Indian head of government was given that privileged position. And unlike President Xi, who talked about business and trade, Modi spoke about culture. I thought it was a very thoughtful thing he said there. I mean, you don't associate thoughts with our political leadership, but somebody wrote the speech. It was a very good speech. To suggest that India has something to offer in the cultural realm, and not just in the Indian space, global space. Remember, he's addressing the global elite, economic elite and political elite. And this is interesting because, globalization has been seen traditionally as extension of the West. How country X or country Y relates to westernization, what is the degree of interaction, that is the study. Much of the study is based on that. Now there's something else happening. And this is one indication of that. So will that mean that Indian media flows, whether it's entertainment from India or news from China, which is growing and is likely to grow, especially in the social media space, will it be necessarily contra to what the dominant discourse is, or will it complement an existing dominant structure? Because essentially, even the Chinese are operating in a marketplace. Yeah, think of the Chinese internet. So again, that's something I want you to think about, whether they're really contra or are they complementary. Yeah, because essentially they're operating in a market system. Another area which deserves deep thinking is the future of the internet and how you theorize that. Internet has emerged from the United States. US still continues to control it, both its infrastructure, its commerce, but its usage has changed. And how that then leads to a different kind of internet, a non-Americanized internet, is something which requires a lot of thinking in terms of media theory. How do you theorize that? And my final point, which I think is particularly relevant for a country like India, is that despite really impressive economic growth in Asia, both in China and India, China is still a developing country, and we are still a poor country. We are home. We have the distinction of being the home to largest number of poor people in the world. Although the latest report from World Bank says that now it's Nigeria, not us. But I don't know, I have to read the report. I only read the report about the report. And the whole developmental discourse, the whole aid industry, the whole NGO world, which has expanded exponentially in the last 20 years, part of a neoliberal discourse. That is being challenged by precisely what happened in China in terms of reduction of poverty. And to some extent in India. I'll show you the difference between the two in a minute. In terms of communication in media. There's a whole subfield of communication studies which is about development communication. And I had the privilege to work in that field for a while. And that field is still very much dominated by US or European theories, and increasingly in this neoliberal world, it is almost hostage to the NGOization of development. It's the NGOs who will do development. Governments are corrupt and inefficient. So, why am I saying that in terms of theorizing? Precisely because what the Chinese have achieved in terms of reducing, if not eliminating, poverty. This is a chart that I again concocted from, not concocted, I put together from a report that just been published last year by World Bank. And I will request your indulgence for 30 seconds to look at these figures carefully and what they reveal. So, the World Bank defines extreme poverty as $1.90 income per day, less than $2. This chart shows the number of people living in extreme poverty in China and India. So, in 1990, China had 756 million people living in abject poverty, as against 338 million people in India. Think about it. China opens up to the world in late 70s. So by the 1990s, they already have those economic zones. It's already become a factory to the world. It's growing at double digits. It has 756 million people in abject poverty. So China has double the number of people in extreme poverty than in India. Fast forward to 2013. 25 million. We have 218 million. So we got to 120 million. They got rid of 700 million plus. One party state, much maligned Communist Party. We are the largest democracy in the world. We have, huge mobility of our elites. The people in Delhi don't speak English. They come from rural Rajasthan or Bihar. Doesn't matter. Now, this is not taught in development courses anywhere outside China. Not in our universities. People don't know this. I very strongly feel about it, and I speak about it all the time. So I showed this chart at a conference last year. I was in Xiamen in China, where there was the BRICS conference. BRICS summit was there. And I showed these figures, and the Chinese professor, very distinguished Chinese professor, said to me afterwards, when you come here next time, this will be gone. I trust him. Now, this is not being done by NGOs, by Oxfam, by UNDP. It's done by the much maligned government at a considerable cost to the ecology of China. Right? So, if you are in development communication business, you have a problem. Because data speaks for itself. It's World Bank data, by the way, it's not Chinese government data. So, we have been told outside China that this is just a one-party state, it is stop. People can't use Facebook, they can't watch pornography, whatever. We can do all of that, but we have millions of people living in extreme poverty even today in 2018. So, in terms of theorizing it, we got to look elsewhere. The distinguished professors in Harvard and Oxford are not going to explain this. And that's, I want to leave you with that thought, that you got to think, you got to reflect, how come after 70 plus years of independence, we can't provide drinking water to millions of people? Coca-Cola they can drink, and all the fuzzy drinks that with poison in them, they can drink that, but they can't drink basic drinking water. You know? And on that note, I'll stop so that we have time for discussion and provocation. Thank you for listening. Okay, so we got about half an hour. I think they're not recording now, so you can ask me questions, comments before lunch. So who wants to go first? And you could also, I mean, if there are questions from the first lecture, I'm very happy to respond. It doesn't have to be a question, it could be comment, it could be disagreement, more interesting.
So if I may speak, like when we talk about globalization, I mean, we are essentially talking about the shift of power of globalization, like who is yielding more power, who is having more participation in that.
Yeah.
But we are exactly not touching on the nature of globalization itself.
Yes.
Because today when we talk of globalization, it's more about the elite of the world uniting. We gave the examples of Indian companies figuring in fortune companies. So it's welcome to the globalization, the Indian companies are also featuring there.
Yeah.
And again, when we talk of China and the exponential growth they have that had after accepting capitalism, it in fact shows that for capitalism to thrive, you actually don't need a representative government. With the Western democracies are so far kind of having a deal and saying that we have capitalism, but we still need a elected representative to push the forward system. So so when we talk of globalization and the rearrangements of the economic system, it's still not very clear that whether we are having a new system at all. It's like
no, I'm glad you asked. It's a very, very important and very relevant question. In fact, that relates also what I was saying in my previous lecture. So again, I think India also is an interesting case, but I'll speak about that later. But let me respond by talking about China first. China actually, I don't know, I mean, I'm not a China expert, I only know a little bit about it. If you look at the Chinese communist history also, it's very different from the Soviet communism. Yeah? The Sino-Soviet split takes place in 1957. Even, it's 8 years, just 8 years after the Chinese, modern Chinese state is formed, and they have split with the Russians. And actually, Nehru was one of the first people who said that Chinese communism is different. And India was one of the few countries which was actually very supportive of China getting into the UN. And, we before the 62 thing, we had, really good. I mean, Nehru had that understanding of the world the way that, I have to say, current regime doesn't seem to be interested in. That kind of vision, bigger view of the world. This was before internet. So that they have had a very distinctive communism, because the primary level of analysis was a peasant, not an industrial worker. They were not industrialized. So their policies were geared for that. Of course, there were a lot of horrible things they did with cultural revolution, and they were horrible. That's therefore what China doing today is all the more remarkable, having had that experience where the state itself kills not just one, millions of people. Estimates vary for 30 to 40 million. Some say even more. At least in India, despite all the problems, that has not happened. The state hasn't been, in the kind of large-scale mass killing that the communists did. So their version of communism was different. Similarly, when they opened up to the market, capitalism, they did not, let the party or the government lose control. And in fact, I was watching something the other day, yesterday it was, Shiv Shankar Menon, one of our distinguished analysts, who was the Foreign Secretary and also National Security Advisor. There's an interview with Shekhar Gupta on NDTV, worth watching if you haven't seen. So he made a very interesting point. He said, no, he was in China in 1989 when the Tiananmen Square happened. And he said, most of the analysis was based on what was happening in Europe. So in Europe, people were, going on streets and the governments fell. And he said, China is different. This won't happen in China. And there will be bloodbath, but they will not lose control. It's a different system. So the way they dealt with capitalism was also very different. In the sense that they say, okay, we will keep the control, we'll copy, we'll ape, we'll just get the best people to kind of, we'll make things, then we'll make our own. So that's what has happened now. So I use the phrase cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics in this book that I've just published. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about the internet in a couple of days' time. So the Chinese system, it's early days, but I think you could argue that the Chinese version of capitalism is slightly different because the state has a very, very important role. Even the corporations are essentially working in very close, connection with the state, with the party. It's a one-party state, right? It's party-state elite. So I think that raises some interesting questions about the traditional view of globalization. This is all corporations which are setting the scene, etc. If anything, there is a kind of reaction to that, and states are getting more prominent. And not China is the ultimate example, but even in India, think of the net neutrality debate, right? Despite all the bear hugs in the Modi had with Mr. Zuckerberg, they didn't allow free basics here, right? And they have, despite what the Americans are doing with net neutrality, India took a position that we won't have, So there is a certain amount of autonomy that big countries, despite their many problems, have. And India, I think, again, as I said before the lecture also, in terms of the way India has dealt with globalization, with opening up its sectors, I use the phrase calibrated globalization, not my phrase, Government of India's phrase, was actually very thoughtful. That we don't want to open everything, we'll open gradually. You have those millions of shops. If you have multi-story, and these supermarkets, then millions of people would not have anything to eat. So, it's not just because they have a vote. There's also a discourse which takes that into account. And I think therefore India cannot be a total free market, especially. So despite liberalization, now look at Modi government, it's probably the most pro-business government in India's history. But they haven't done anything radical in this area. They're still kind of, it's a baby steps, which let's open up. Air India ko nahi bech paaye yaar, aur kya lena hai? They can't sell Air India of all places. So I think that's why I mentioned China and India, because I think there is a certain version, if you remember, I had New Globalization with a question mark. Because this is something, again, it's too early to say, but I would suggest that especially the Chinese, and we should learn from that. Really, we should learn from that. And my last slide, perhaps that should be an eye-opener for all Indians. How can these guys, we are in IIT, the top institution in this country. We haven't been able to develop a mobile phone which is Indian. Our server is Chinese. Our server in this country is Chinese. So there's something that we need to think about. Possibly it's just we're too much looking to the West. In the process, we've forgotten these guys they've arrived. Anyway, so that's in a sort of roundabout way answer to your question. But this is a debate that we should continue. Somebody in the front?
Following that, only, I think the discussion that we're having right now.
Yes.
When you talked about the new globalization thing, so the countries like US and China and many more countries, they are into a protectionist mode in relation to their trade, their profit, their marketing and everything. So I think this to be a transitional. I think that this is a transitional phase in international trade.
Yeah.
So when we talk about digital media in a global age, and when it is deglobalization, followed with deglobalization and protectionism from various mighty powers, then what is going to be the role of digital media? How digital media is going to contribute to this whole change?
Well, very, very good question. But that's why I mentioned these two countries, because, just imagine that everybody in India and everybody in China is online, which will happen next 20 years, maybe sooner, right? So, what kind of content will be traveling in international electronic superhighways? In what language? What kind of jokes will be there? Yeah. Abhi to, we are conditioned to think about internet as an American phenomenon, understandably, as an English language phenomenon. You look at the figures for English language news channels in India. कितने लोग देखते हैं उसको? It's so tiny. If it wasn't funded by questionable means, it will close tomorrow, right? So I think that if people are connected and they are producing this content of different quality, a lot of it is pretty awful and it has to be, but it will then make things different in the sense that if I don't know whether you remember this is a long time ago, I think year 2000, when BBC did a poll about the most popular political leader in the world. You know who won? Mr. Lal Krishna Advani. किसी से पूछो बाहर अडवाणी कौन है, किसी को नहीं पता. You ask somebody in rural Bengal, they don't know who Advani is. He got elected. Why? Because even then they had a trolls party. So they just voted. जीत गए वो. So if you have 1 billion people online, you can manipulate every election in the world, right? And then you have another 1.2 billion Chinese. So it has implications beyond media, beyond communications, implication to, so think of, Murdoch coming to India, Rupert Murdoch. He lost a lot of money. For 10 years he lost money. But if you are a billionaire, a few million don't matter to you. And today Star Plus is the top company in this country, right? So even if you're paying 1 rupee, that's 1 billion rupees. That's a lot of money. You are in, Denmark, there are 4 million people. कितने phone होंगे यार? 5 phone होंगे तब भी 20 million हुए ना? I think that is why it is so important, the scale. And that's why it's so important for Indian corporates and governments and intellectuals to think of an Indian internet, an Indian governance structure, an Indian infrastructure, an Indian ideology of the internet. Abhi ye ki derivative. We are just trying to because our education system, because the way, if you think of every middle class family today in India has somebody either working or studying in the United States or in Europe, right? So that creates a we are so much connected with the West. My generation was not. Present generation is. So we don't have that connect to other parts of the world, so we don't know what's happening in China. Except Dokulam and, cheap ghadiya, whatever. We don't know. And we go to Oxford and we listen to these characters who have no idea. And then we quote it shamelessly. Professor such and such said this, something very banal. We say that. वो PhD में लिखते हैं हम लोग. नहीं लिखोगे तो मार्क नहीं मिलेगा. दो बार पास हो गए तो अनपढ़ हो. You don't know anything about how can you be a PhD? You don't know Professor such and such. Right? वो हमको कोट नहीं करते. उनसे किससे पूछो आप कि चाणक्य कौन है? And I'm not saying because I'm Indian. There are dozens of examples from other parts of the world. So, for instance, do you guys know that the oldest continuously surviving university in the world is where? कौन सी भाई पाकिस्तान में बताइए मुझे. मैं नहीं बता continuously surviving university. वो तो ruins हैं. वो पाकिस्तान तब नहीं था. हाँ? नहीं नालंदा भी continuous की बात कर रहा हूँ ना. जो कभी बंद नहीं हुई जब से चल रही है. वो इजिप्ट में है, कायरो में. Al Azhar University in Egypt, which is 100 years older than the oldest university in Europe. किसी को नहीं पता, अरब्स को पता है, उसको पता नहीं है. अब्दुल कलाम आज़ाद जो हमारे एजुकेशन मिनिस्टर थे वहाँ के पढ़े. People don't know who Abdul Kalam Azad was. So, end of story. The point is कि हमको, you know, we had Takshashila, we had you know, Nalanda, and there are many more. We were a very important intellectual center of the world. तो हम ये तो लोगों का झूठा खा के जी रहे हैं. We are eating people's leftovers when we have the most incredible cuisine in the world. उससे बड़ी बात क्या हो सकती है कि झूठन खा रहे हैं लोगों की. उस पर हमें गर्व है कि यार हमने, आई कोटेड दैट पर्सन, यू नो, वो कॉन्फिडेंस चाहिए. You know, whatever I have very serious disagreement with Mr. Modi's lot of things, but one thing I like about him, एक confidence है उस आदमी. When he says there's whatever crore Indians, no, I mean it seriously, not in the political sense, because वो जो इंडिया की elite है, it is so worried about the white man. ये नहीं घबराता, ये आँख मिला के बात करता. आप देखो, कभी वीडियो देखो उसका, he talks to people, ठीक है आप भी कुछ हो मैं भी कुछ हूँ, I'm not. And that is very important psychologically for a country like ours. You know, you have to say, okay, Chinese don't have that problem. You know, we don't realize how colonized our minds are, even today. And therefore, it's so important to say, you know, we don't need to be apologetic about anything. We've got everything. We just have to move it to the next level. This internet की बात. अब देखिए ना, there is so much money in this country. You know, these really clever business people, they realize, they are not stupid. तो ये अभी ये इंटरनेट वाला हुआ, ये फ्री बेसिस का, ये ऐसे ही थोड़ी हो गया. There are very strong domestic interests. They realize, why should we give it to these idiots? हम अपना बनाएंगे. लेकिन वो जाली बन जाता ना, जाली फ़ोन बनाया था उन्होंने 500 रुपये का, you remember? वो बंद हो गया बंसल जी, in prison. तो आ गया था अखबार में सब जगह, India is going to make a 500 rupee whatever phone. जेल में है ना. तो वही हमारा कि वी डोंट रियली प्रॉपरली नहीं करते काम, और एजम्पशन ये है कि चल जाएगा. जैसे आज मैं सुबह आया, मुझे 10 बजे यहाँ लेक्चर है मेरा, आई वाज वेटिंग टिल 9:50. मैंने कहा मुझे आ गया बाद में, चल कोई बात नहीं, ठीक है हो गया ना, कोई दिक्कत नहीं हुई. आई वाज हियर बिफोर 10, इट वाज डन, इट वाज ओके, आई होप. सो एनीवे, और कुछ और? यस,
The last slide you have shown is in the last slide
Yes,
you have shown.
yes.
This is in the number. So I think it would be good for us to also know it in the percentage of the population, if the data shown along with the percentage of the
वो
population.
कैलकुलेट कर लीजिए आप, क्या
Yeah, but when you are showing it, it would have been great. Maybe it would be give us a little bit more on that.
I had the absolute number. No, I could do that, but it's not the
You
point.
wanted to show the number only.
If it is from 756 to 25 million in 20 years.
The population is also increasing.
So even today, if you look at any data, and you know, people say this, you know, you only go to Shanghai and Beijing, you don't know how poor China is. China has a lot of poverty, but I'm very desi, I know my country very well, I should say that, despite having lived in the UK for 30 years. And the comparison is not comparable. वो बहुत आगे हैं हमसे, हमको सीखना है उनसे, कैसे, हाउ डिड दे डू दैट, व्हाई का. जब मैं फर्स्ट टाइम चाइना गया था, आई वाज आस्किंग, आई हैव a colleague Chinese who is now a reader in my university. At that time she was a PhD student, and she was showing me around and asking that ये क्यों है, why is this like this, why is that like that. And she said, you know, you are asking very different questions than the white colleagues I used to do. And I said, look, I'm looking at China from Indian eyes. And I'm saying, why is it that their public spaces are so clean and ours are not? ये rocket science थोड़े है यार, it's not rocket science. Why should toilets be so dirty? Basic चीजें. So why are the trains running normally? Why हमारे यहाँ तो ट्रेन लेना एक प्रोजेक्ट है दिल्ली में. और अगर आपके साथ कोई बच्चा हो या कोई, you know, somebody who is not well or some old person, खत्म हुई कहानी. वो within 30 seconds से अब वो प्लेटफॉर्म नंबर 15 पे आएगी. आप जाइए, आप सीढ़ी भी नहीं है, मतलब वो लिफ्ट भी नहीं है, जाइए सामान को लेकर. So you know, these are very basic things. It is something to do with your attitude. Same with poverty. I mean, one of the things that we have, which is that we are a profoundly kind of vigorous democracy, and we should be very proud of that. That is, Chai Wala's son is the prime minister, irrespective of his political affiliation. आप agree करो उससे ना करो, but the fact is that he has risen from there to become the prime minister of this country. If you are a municipal councillor, आपके दिमाग यहाँ होते हैं. Prime minister बन गया तो छोटी चीज़ नहीं है, it's a big thing. But we are a profoundly undemocratic society. Profoundly undemocratic society. We have structural divisions in our society, and we retain those. आप तमिल हो, आप तेलुगु हो, आप मुसलमान हो, आप अपर कास्ट हो, आप कुर्मी हो, etc. Just imagine a society where we don't have that. Just imagine for a moment. And what would that mean for development? Here, why I say to me, I live in UK, as you know, so I come very regularly. I'm here, and the assumption is that somebody who belongs to a particular caste. मैं पंडित आदमी, by the way, right? So I'm top of the caste. I'm a Kashmiri Pandit. So let me make that clear. The guy will come and clean your toilet. तो मैं कहता हूँ वो पढ़ भी लिया उसने, वो MP भी है, वो अभी टॉयलेट साफ करेगा आपका. So you got to either provide decent system or do it yourself. That's the mindset change. जब आप बाहर जाते करते ना, कोई वहाँ तो नौकर नहीं आता आपका, आप अमेरिका में खुद करते. So I think that's what is so important, and in societies like China, whatever there's so many horrible things they did. I mentioned earlier. औरतों को पढ़ाया, hugely important. And उनके यहाँ वो नहीं है जो हमारे यहाँ. They are all खान, एक डायग्नोस उसके रहने, सब नहीं है लेकिन majority है, and they don't have those problems that we have. And I think unless we, so it's not a question of ठीक है, percentage might still, but yeah, the reality is that what they have achieved is unprecedented in human history. In human history, कि 700 मिलियन लोगों को आपने 20 साल में गरीबी से हटा दिया. वॉर नहीं हुई, रेवोल्यूशन नहीं हुआ, नॉर्मल से. तो वो 10% पे जो ग्रो कर रहे थे, वो हम भी 7% पे ग्रो कर रहे हैं. हम 7% ग्रो कर रहे हैं, और इनइक्वालिटी हमारे यहाँ बढ़ रही है, right? So it's not that there isn't money, it's a lot more. When I was a student, we had no money. You can't believe how poorly resourced the universities were. But we had a better standard. लोग ठीक ठाक थे, right? क्योंकि वो Facebook पे नहीं देख रहे थे, they were reading books. But anyway, I shouldn't be too. Sorry.
Yeah, the question was that you say that the power equation is creating
Yeah.
as a barrier for theorizing medium communication. Can you explain on that point why the power equation is creating a barrier for theorizing medium communication?
Because see, why do we listen to media theories which have developed in the US? The US is the power. कल हमारे पास power होगी तो we will have our own, media journals will get published in our journals. They will be respected, they will be refereed. We will have publishing which will be noticed. Will say वहाँ किताब छपी है, उसमें ये article, जैसे हम आप करते हैं, right? They didn't do it in one day. It took a long time, and that's what I was saying about professionalism. Why? You just think about it. Why is it when Indians go abroad, 9 out of 10 do okay in whatever field? So there must be something in our culture which is actually pretty good. Our schooling is pretty good. आजकल का पता नहीं है. मैं तो हिंदी माध्यम में पढ़ा हुआ है. From schooling to PhD, entirely educated in India, and extremely proud of that fact. Not been corrupted by Western education. I taught Westerners how to think, but I have been, so because we had good education, we had teachers we respected. They had no money. They will give you like 500 रुपए की salary भी नहीं मिलती थी, but they were teachers. They taught you. आज ये आलम है कि you meet people वो कार्ड देते, मैं डीन हूँ साहब. कहाँ के डीन है साहब? मैं इस इंस्टीट्यूट में. Not read a book in their lives. Dean है. So sorry, I'm sorry. कोई बैठा हुआ डीन जिसने किताब नहीं पढ़ी वहाँ भी. So I think it takes time. So the point is, what I was referring to was once there is a power shift, then Chinese are already doing it. It's interesting. They have Chinese Journal Communication Review आउटलेट वाले छापते हैं. एक China and Global Media में उसका they made me chief editor. It was launched a couple of years ago. So I don't know people. I just because of my work. So that's what is great about our job. काम करोगे तो लोग बुलाएंगे आपको भाई, क्योंकि काम बोलता है ना, आप नहीं बोलते, काम बोलता है. It's out there. अब यहाँ लोग हैं कि वो मतलब we don't care about it. It doesn't matter. It does matter. And we have so much talent. We need to get our. And I'm so happy that this kind of thing is happening, where people get together and they talk for a few days about research and about ideas. I don't know how often you get that time in your everyday life to talk about, because there's so much pressure. I know, in especially sort of private universities, research is not real private, है ना? तो उसमें कैसे फिर next faculty कहाँ से आएगी? But we are dealing in ideas, ना? We need people to have some kind of. You can't be just doing जो routine काम होता है. It's over and above that. So yes.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Should I ask both of them now? or-
Please do, please do. Yeah.
So the first one is related to this. You said that from the presentation it seemed that when you're developing a theory for studying the internet, you would more look at usage than at the structures, for example. Like the usage, who's using the internet is going to be a more stronger base for developing a theory than the actual structures of the
But
internet.
also infrastructure. Look at the Chinese infrastructure. It's all theirs. They don't have American.
So, but like you said, lots of the infrastructure that we use is actually just
American,
copied and
yeah.
sort of
Yeah,
changed
yeah,
here.
yeah.
So when you are developing a theory,
Yes.
how instructive is it to just look at usage, or which one should you give more preference to in the present day?
I don't think it's either or, really. I mean,
It's both.
it's both. It's all because infrastructure is extremely important.
But so assuming at this point in time,
Yes.
if you were to start developing a theory to sort of see what is happening right now,
Yes.
which one would you give more preference to? Is
Because
it-
the
is-
audience is already, the usage is already happening and is hugely under theorized. Because if you think of audience literature in our field, it's mostly done in relation to some study in the US, some is in the UK. Not just India, by the way, it's also Africa, Latin America, rest of the world essentially. It doesn't get into it because call it intellectual hegemony, call it accidents of history, call it the importance of English language, whatever it is, there is a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is there not because it's a conspiracy, but they've been doing it for much longer. Simple. So if you think of media and communication in our country, it is a relatively new field. If you look at traditional universities, there are very few places where they taught it. And they would have journalism classes which were very industry oriented, where what I have been talking about doesn't figure in any syllabus, anything.
We never had books. We never taught.
हाँ, I know. मैं इसलिए मैंने कहा ना कि मैंने हिस्ट्री में MA किया है, मेरा पॉलिटिकल साइंस में दूसरा MA है, मेरा PhD इंटरनेशनल रिलेशन से है JNU में, उसके बाद मैं मीडिया पढ़ा रहा हूँ. अगर मैं सिर्फ मीडिया पढ़ा तो मैं तो आई फील इंटेलेक्चुअली वेरी इनसिक्योर. कुछ पढ़ा ही नहीं है आपने, क्या पढ़ाएंगे आप? No, I am not exaggerating. I am making a very, very serious statement. And therefore, it's so important that there is a disciplinary background. कुछ भी पढ़िए आप, sociology, literature, psychology, anthropology, politics, doesn't matter. But you have to have some grounding. Otherwise, it becomes very superficial. And I think that's one of our problems. So, to answer your question, in our field particularly, there's still a lot to do because it's such a new field. और जो दुकानें खुल गई ना, pardon my language, उसमें तो कोई there is no scope for research. There's no, or they are not interested in research. वो कहते research PhD करेगी, क्या करेगी PhD करके भाई? Why do you need a PhD? Why should you give it here 3 years off? हमारे यहाँ यूनिवर्सिटी में, और मैं बहुत आई मीन ऑर्डिनरी यूनिवर्सिटी, आई एम नॉट इन हार्वर्ड, हमारी यूनिवर्सिटी में PhD स्टूडेंट्स को इंटरनेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस में जाने के लिए पैसा मिलता है. They get £1,000, they go, they present, they learn, they get published, they meet people. I don't think that happens here. Teachers को नहीं मिलता. No, you're right.
The second question is about contraflow.
जी.
So दो example दिए थे आपने. One was China.
हाँ, news का. हाँ.
And one was Al Jazeera.
जी.
So are they the same type, or is that the same type of contraflow? क्योंकि there's an idea about being against the hegemony, that is the counter hegemony.
Yeah.
Plus
Yeah, sorry.
Political or apolitical?
Huh?
seem
No,
useful.
that's. I mean, I did a book on that some years ago, 10 years ago. It was called "Media on the Move: Global
So
Flow and
one of them
Contraflow."
had a, Naomi Sapir had a
Huh? Once Al
paper on
Jazeera.
Al
She was
Jazeera
my colleague.
essay.
It's an interesting piece in that. Yes.
So she was talking about it being apolitical
Huh.
sense.
Uh, since then, lots have changed in Al Jazeera. The I was saying also in relation to China, India about this, whether they are contra or complementary. So, for instance, again, I have a lecture on the news media, so I'll talk about this in more detail then. But they are not necessarily contra, because in many cases they are operating in a system which is market-led, and so the basic system is very similar. They have to sell their products, etc. Although in the context of news is slightly different, because the Chinese government is spending all that money, they're not getting any money back. There's no advertising. Al Jazeera has very limited advertising. It's only Qatari government which pays them for advertising. There's no advertising. So those of you who work in the media sector or have worked in the media sector will know if you don't have advertising, you can't survive. You will close in a few weeks. So how come Al Jazeera has survived for 10 years? So then you get into the realm of politics and international relations, and it's not about news; it's something else. So the contra thing in terms of news is deeply political. So RT, for example, Russia Today, which is called Russia Today, is an essentially anti-Western platform. उनको और कोई नज़र नहीं आता इंडिया मतलब दुनिया में वेस्ट में कोई अच्छा काम करे तो वो उनकी न्यूज़ में नहीं आता इट्स ऑलवेज नेगेटिव एंड टू द एक्सटेंट दैट इट बिकम्स देन बोरिंग बिकॉज एक ही राग है तो अब कितना भी संगीत में इंटरेस्ट हो आपको एक राग से बोर हो जाते हैं यू वांट समथिंग एल्स Okay, we got the lunch is at 1, so I think we're nearly there. But I can take one more question or yes. हाँ sorry वो आपके पड़ोस उनसे मैं पुराना नाता है मेरा उनको मैं जगह देनी पड़ेगी उनको. He looked after me when I was in Pune. हाँ पूछिए सर.
No, I just wanted your views little more if you can talk about how Modi's promote culture in the forum and
हाँ.
then selling India or talking about India and India's view on globalization. So if you can spend a few minutes on
I
relevance of
you see because I wrote a book on that soft power thing. So this वो पढ़ लीजिए सब लिखा है उसमें. लेकिन मोदी का थोड़ा वो है ना कि अंग्रेजी में एक सेइंग होती है यू वीकन द थिंग यू एक्सेजरेट है ना तो आपको चिल्लाने की ज़रूरत नहीं है कि आपके यहाँ नालंदा थी आपके यहाँ नालंदा लेकिन नालंदा को बनाओ अभी मानो चीनियों ने क्या किया यू नो दिस आई डोंट नो एनी ऑफ यू दे हैव बिल्ड देयर ओन नालंदा वो थी ना दे वर इन्वॉल्व इन नालंदा प्रोजेक्ट एंड देन दे रियलाइज कि यहाँ उन्होंने इसको वीसी बनाया उसको कोई तमीज़ नहीं है वीसी बन गई पता नहीं कैसे बनी सॉरी यार किसी का कोई आई डोंट नो आई एम वेरी व्हाट इज द वर्ड इन हिंदी मूफट सो दे नथिंग इज हैपनिंग ऑन दैट 30-40 बच्चे आए हैं उनके यहाँ और वो अमेरिकन लड़की आई कि उसने कुछ लिखा तो उसको लिखने नहीं दिया कि तुम हिंदूज़ को वो कर रही हो ऑफेंड कर रही हो एनीवे इट्स रियली सिली. So the Chinese have started their own Buddhist university. They've got people from Sri Lanka, Thailand, and अभी आप वेब पे देखिएगा उनका पूरा उन्हें शहर बना दिया पूरा. तो कथनी और करनी में फ़र्क है. तो हम लोग बात ज़्यादा करते हैं काम कम करते हैं. पुरानी आदत है हमारी. उन्हें कहा ना argumentative Indian, so we like to argue. That goes back to Upanishads and Vedas. तो कोई मतलब there is no truth. It's a matter of interpretation. तो मैंने आपको फिगर दिखाई वैसे एक फिगर है डजंट मैटर हम तो ठीक है हमें क्या प्रॉब्लम है आप बाहर निकलोगे बच्चा भीख मांग रहा है बच्चा आप तो डजंट मैटर वो तो हम तो बचपन से देखते आए हैं क्या बड़ी बात है तो चीन में नहीं मांगता बच्चा भीख या और कई देशों में लोग सड़क पे नहीं रिलीव करते हैं अपने आप को दिस इज अ फैंटास्टिक स्टोरी सम ऑफ यू मे जस्ट टेक 1 मिनट विच इज़ रिलेटेड टू कल्चर जब ख्रुश्चेव भारत आया था 50s में Khrushchev was the Secretary General of Communist Party of Russia. He came with Kosygin, who was the foreign minister. Nehru Prime Minister थे. उस ज़माने की बात हुई 50s के लिए 50s की. So Nehru took him to Agra. ताज देखना है ताज देखना ज़रूरी है. So they were in the train. अब 2-3 घंटे लगते थे उस ज़माने में स्लो ट्रेन होती थी. तो as the train was early morning they went. As the train was approaching Agra, Nehru stood up and he was closing all the windows. तो ये खुश्चेव वो पेजेंट बैकग्राउंड का था, वो लाउड आदमी था, तो कहता है कि why you close, I mean, जैसे भी बोला उसने, आई डोंट नो इंटरप्रेशन, why you closing these windows, he'll get up and वो शटर भी गिरा रहा था नीचे। तो फिर जब उसने, he was a peasant guy, I have got to see it, वो खोला था, लोग, people are relieving themselves, so he said, Nehru, what is this? तो बोलता है it will take time। तो शरीफ आदमी था, पंडित आदमी था, थोड़ा सा रिफाइंड था, it will take time। 2018 में आप आगरा जाओ, तो ये शर्म की बात है कि भारत का प्रधानमंत्री, irrespective of his background, he goes to the लाल किला and he says, यार टॉयलेट बनाओ इस देश में। शर्म की बात है। जिस देश में आप मतलब you can send stuff to Mars at the cost of a Hollywood film, सोचने वाली बात है ना कि we can't do toilets, I mean तो उसमें फिर बहस होती, लोग कहते हैं कि यार कैसे होगा, नहीं हो सकता कि बाहर से कोई गोरा आएगा वो बनाएगा आपके लिए टॉयलेट, आपको टॉयलेट नहीं बना सकते, और बना दिया तो उसके बाद में पानी नहीं है, तो वो कहते हैं यार अनपढ़ आदमी, इसको ऐड दिखाता है, अमिताभ बच्चन बोलते हैं भी दरवाज़ा बंद किया करो, वो क्यों बंद करेगा दरवाज़ा, ही विल गो इन द ओपन बिकॉज देयर इज नो वाटर, देयर इज नो सिस्टम टू डील विद द मेस। बुनियादी बात है ना, अगर इफ़ यू रिलीव योरसेल्फ यू टू क्लीन इट, यू कांट लीव इट देयर, दैट्स व्हाई दे विल गो आउट बिकॉज इट्स सेफर। ये न्यूक्लियर साइंस नहीं, बहुत बुनियादी बात है, तो वो हम नहीं कर सकते। तो जो वो कल्चर की बात करते हैं ना, तो इट साउंड्स वेरी गुड, हम लोग जब जाते हैं बाहर, हमारा काम ही होता है, हम बड़ी बड़ी बातें करते हैं देश के बारे में, वी हैव लॉट्स ऑफ थिंग्स टू से, लेकिन जब बाहर से बंदा आता है, वो क्रुश्चेव वाला किस्सा, then it all sounds empty. You know, this Shashi Tharoor wrote a very interesting book on this some time ago, and so उसका एक statement था कि अगर आपके यहाँ मतलब if you can't provide the basic amenities to majority of Indians, then any talk about culture and soft power sounds hollow because it is not, तो आपको हमको ठीक लगता है, हम पढ़े लिखे लोग हैं, we are a tiny minority, but if we want to move to the next stage, we got to look to address some very basic, and I think media communication has a very important, that's why I'm emphasizing it, very important role. आज ये आलम है कि भारत के किसी भी अखबार में डेवलपमेंट एडिटर नहीं है, एक्सेप्ट प्रॉब्ली हिंदू में था, पता नहीं है कि नहीं है, एक्सप्रेस में है, डेली, गुड, आई एम हैप्पी टू हियर। आई थिंक वी शुड स्टॉप बिकॉज खाना आ गया होगा, इट्स 1 o'clock, द फूड वाज कमिंग, सो वी कैन कंटिन्यू कन्वर्सेशन ओवर lunch. I think is it till 2:30? And then we are meeting for the, tutorial also. Also, I have to tell you about your assessment. We're going to talk about that also. ठीक है? Okay. Thank you.
এখানে তো বলো বাইরে দেবে এখনো আসেনি আসলে বাইরে দেবে একটু হাঁটা চলা I'm just outside. मेरे फास्ट फूड वगैरह मैं घर का खाती ही नहीं घर में खाना ही नहीं बनता है मेरा नेट का स्ट्रेस इसको तो हो जाएगा तुम्हारा डाउनलोड हो गया क्या
वो मैंने ऑनलाइन उन लोगों को फोन किया, उन लोगों ने मुझे गाइड किया और जैसे उन्होंने मुझे गाइड किया वैसे मैंने उसको डाउनलोड किया तो मेरे फ़ोन एक दिन बंद हुआ उसके बाद चालू ही नहीं हुआ तो मैं डेट हमारे को का मदरबोर्ड खराब सारा कुछ खत्म हो गया सिर्फ कॉन्टैक्ट्स आए बाकी कुछ नहीं आया अच्छा लगा ना
बट मेरा इससे कोई मतलब नहीं है डिजिटल से तो
मेरी इंटरेस्ट है
हमारा स्कॉलरशिप अलग जाएगा
जाना पड़ता है अटेंडेंस के लिए हर वीक जाना पड़ता है वीक में एक बार
नहीं एक्चुअली अभी रखा तो मैं जॉब नहीं कर रही हूँ
हाँ वो तो अभी फिलहाल मैं
Is it just me or is the AC here too cold?
Otherwise usually I really like AC मुझे तो बहुत
नहीं
अच्छा लग रहा है
अभी तो मजा है
अरे रात भर AC नहीं आया
अच्छा नहीं moreover the weather is humid ना तो after a point it would start
becomes a little ठंडा too ठंडा also you probably wearing a slightly thicker material
का देना पड़ता था, इस बार तो 2.5 दिन का हमको देना पड़ता है।